Certainly a lot more we could say about Mormonism, but again, we're kind of doing a brief survey. But are there any other questions you have, anything I can clarify or explain in more detail? The last of the new groups that I want to talk about today is Jehovah's Witnesses. They too started in the 19th century, but they didn't actually get the name Jehovah's Witnesses until the 20th century. It's actually in the 1930s where they get that name. The founder of this group was known as Charles Cades Russell, who was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1852. Grew up a Presbyterian, but with all the interest in the second coming of Christ, like with the Millerites that we talked about before spring break, that guy that tried to figure out with all the numbers, trying to figure out when Jesus would return. Well, this was also interesting to Russell as well. And so eventually he left Presbyterianism because of these teachings about the second coming of Christ. And so he too becomes very interested in the prophetic literature, right? He's wanting to know and understand Daniel and Ezekiel and Revelation especially. And so he puts a lot of time and effort into studying these prophecies and is expansively searching all sorts of scholarly literature and other types of things, trying to understand. And as he's even still a teenager at this point, right? It's 1870, so he's about 18 years old. He starts, gaining people, gaining followers, but he starts sharing this information with other people and kind of starts these study groups. And these study groups refer to themselves as Bible students. But the intent isn't really to start a new group. It's just you're studying the Bible together. You're kind of staying within your denominations. But often, because of the distinctive nature of some of these beliefs, especially with regard to the second coming that we'll talk about here in a minute, a lot of people ended up leaving traditional denominations because they didn't find, the people in these denominations didn't necessarily agree or believe these teachings to be true. Many of Russell's distinct beliefs had to do with the afterlife, the end of time, and so one of them was the second coming of Christ. Russell believed that Jesus would return and set up an earthly kingdom, which, that's an idea that's found in other Christian groups as well. And the distinctive part about it is he, like William Miller before him, attempted to figure out when that was going to occur. And while a lot of Christians throughout time have said it's going to occur soon, many of them haven't really set a date. Well, William Miller did, and so did Charles Russell. And so in the early 1870s, he promotes the date that Jesus is going to return fully in 1878. And that's going to bring about this millennial age of Jesus reigning on earth. Now, when Jesus didn't return in 1878, there's this attempt to kind of explain what happened, and then later predicted 1914. 1914 is the date of Jesus' return. 1878 was kind of wrong, but 1914 was going to be the date. And throughout the history of Jehovah's Witnesses, there were other attempts to date the return of Christ, with dates as late as 1975. But after 1975, Jehovah's Witnesses kind of gave up on setting a date, and really there's kind of this selective amnesia that happens to a lot of religious groups. You don't remember those kind of things. Right? The group doesn't focus on that because we have failed prophecy here. And so, all groups kind of have this selective amnesia of, there were some things in our past as a religious group that we're not going to remember because they look bad. So one of the things was his attempt to date when the second coming would occur. And the idea of the second coming is still very important for Jehovah's Witnesses, and a lot of their literature, while they're not dating the return will be focused on, are you ready for the return of Jesus? The end is near kind of focus. Another distinctive doctrine of the Jehovah's Witnesses was the 144,000, coming from the book of Revelation. And Russell believed that the church, from the time of Jesus to the end of time, would be made up of only 144,000 members. And he also promoted the idea in 1881 that this number was pretty much complete, with the possibility that some living members of the 144,000 could fall away. Now, being part of the 144,000 was a special honor that not many people would achieve, including people like Moses and Elijah. It was believed did not attain the 144,000. This was a very special group, a little flock, who would join Jesus in the heavens. Now, 144,000 is not a lot of people if you think of all the Christians from the time of Jesus to the present. So what about the rest of them? Well, everybody else that would be followers of Jesus would be living on earth. After Jesus' return, it would kind of be recreated, and this larger group of people would live on earth. And so being a part of the 144,000 earns you a special place in heaven, but you could still participate in the afterlife. Now, I'm not really sure if Russell promoted this doctrine, but the other question that you would think about is, all right, that's the good people. What about bad? What about the wicked? Well, the traditional doctrine is that at the end of time, the wicked will be annihilated, will cease to exist. So there's not a notion of eternal punishment in heaven. Other distinctive doctrines included, the idea of the 144,000 becoming Jews. That they wouldn't necessarily be ethnically Jewish, but in the millennial kingdom, they would be Jews. And so Jehovah's Witnesses were very active in trying to get a nation state for Israel prior to 1948. And some other things that were kind of connected with that as well. Later on, a lot of other distinctive doctrines would be added. So, for example, blood transfusions. Jehovah's Witnesses, most would refuse a blood transfusion, right? Just like any other religious group, when someone's life is at stake, they might allow for blood transfusion. But the official doctrine is to avoid blood transfusions. The reason behind that is the injunctions in the Old Testament and the New Testament against eating blood. Now, when you get a blood transfusion, as probably you all know, you're not eating blood. All right? They put it into your vein. But they understand the eating of blood as to taking your blood into your body in any way. Right? And so even through blood transfusions. And it's even, when you think about somebody that is preparing for major surgery, right, often a lot of people will donate their own blood in the weeks and months leading up to it so that what's transfused is your own blood into you during surgery, right? To kind of make sure there's no side effects or anything like that. Jehovah's Witnesses won't even do that. And so what has actually kind of happened in kind of an odd circumstance is that they have been involved with several research hospitals who are working on bloodless surgery. Like USC is involved in a lot of this. Now some other products, plasma, some other things, that would be okay, but it's the blood that's the issue. Jehovah's Witnesses also believe that Jesus died on a torture stake rather than a cross. And so just a single pole rather than the T-shape like we think of with the traditional cross. And feel that people kind of made the cross into an idol. Christians have made the cross into an idol. So we talked about they start out as these Bible study groups. But even during Russell's lifetime, they started moving towards institutionalization, eventually becoming congregations, a new denomination known as Jehovah's Witnesses, into the 20th century. In 1884, Russell incorporated his publishing into the Zion's Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which is currently located in Brooklyn. Because he'd been writing so much, he was really prolific and wrote a lot about that. And one of the major pieces that he was producing was a journal, a magazine, called Zion's Watchtower and Herald of Christ's Presence. Within 8 years, Russell was publishing over 4 million copies of this magazine. It is still around, but it's simply called Watchtower these days, so the shortened name. So when Jehovah's Witnesses will come to your door, usually they will ask to leave 2 pieces of literature with you. One of them is the current edition of Watchtower. So a journal, a magazine that has been still around for over 130 years. Russell died in 1916, 2 years after he had predicted that Jesus would return. But a lot of people felt with World War I going on, which is where Russell died, that the events that he had talked about from Scripture were shortly to be unfolded. When he died, many of the Bible students defected. And there was a little bit of a struggle for power with eventually a man named Joseph Rutherford, who was a Missouri lawyer, became the leader of the group and was the one to make it into the Jehovah's Witnesses of today. What questions, what do I need to clarify about Jehovah's Witnesses? Again, we could say a lot more about them. A lot of the things that are distinctive happened more in the 20th century than the 19th. Last thing to talk about with respect to practice in the 19th century is I want to talk a little bit, remind you of some things that Gonzalez talks about. Gonzalez talks about in the reading about a variety of European and American missions to places like India, China, Japan. And most of what he talks about is focused on Catholics and Protestants. What I want to talk about, just briefly, is some Orthodox missions, right, to kind of supplement some of the things that he's doing, because he doesn't really talk too much about Orthodoxy. So, Orthodox Christianity kind of been destabilized in the Middle East because of the takeover of Islam, and so Russia, again, kind of the center there of Orthodoxy. And so in the 19th century, Russian Orthodox ministers started moving into Alaska. And for the late 18th into the 19th century, there is this push into North America. Now, when Catholicism kind of moved into places, it was very slow in establishing a lot of the institutionalization that was in other places, right? In the dioceses and the bishops and kind of that presence of the hierarchy. Orthodox Christians, however, moved much more rapidly. And so they get in there, they establish a diocese, they get a bishop. The first resident bishop of Alaska was ordained in 1840. Now, there was also kind of a different mindset. If you think about back to when we talked about missionary work in the 16th century, when the Spanish came to Mexico, South America, this was New Spain, or we talked about Canada being New France. Well, different mindset for the Orthodox. Alaska was Russia, not New Russia. And so Russians had a variety of physical appearances, right? They didn't all look the same. And so incorporating indigenous peoples of Alaska wasn't as much of an issue. There wasn't that distinction like there was between European Catholics and Native Americans, who were physically quite different in appearance, there's not the same kind of separation like you would get there. In addition, the Orthodox were much more open to blending indigenous native traditions of Alaska with Orthodox traditions. Right? And so that hybridity didn't really upset them too much. Unlike, let's say, the Presbyterians, who are another major group at this time missionizing in Alaska. Eventually, Russians start moving down the west coast, with San Francisco eventually becoming the home of the Russian Orthodox bishop. By 1872, when the Diocese of San Francisco was established, the Orthodox group numbered about 12,000, making it one of the most thriving Indian missions north of Mexico. And so they were very successful. In 1867, however, Russia sold Alaska to the United States. The big impact for Russian Orthodox as well as other Orthodox Christians in North America was predominantly due to immigration. And so eventually there would be a Russian Orthodox Church, Greek Orthodox Church, Bulgarian, Romanian, and as those people immigrated into the United States, not intending on missions, but going for the prosperity, the economic opportunities, religious freedom, some of those kind of things. And so predominantly the Orthodox presence in the United States and other places in North America has come from immigration, not necessarily from missionary activity. What questions do you have? Anything we need to finish up with practice before we move on?